Hello. I wanted to read you the next chapter, or the second part of my book about the history and culture of England. And this is devoted to the Iron Duke, or the Duke of Wellington. And the sub-chapter regards the question, why Britain must today invade France? If such comparisons have any value at all, it would be possible to say that the Duke of Wellington was not as significant a man as Oliver Cromwell was in the history of England. Both of them were military commanders who did not lose a battle and who eventually assumed overall rule of the British Army. Both were for a time in command of the entire country, whether as Prime Minister or as dictator. In fact, both served for a time as dictator. And both saved the nation from foreign invasion and established or increased its former empire. What makes Wellington less outstanding is that he was already part of what could, in common terms, be called a cartel. And the cartel which he belonged to already ruled Britain, while Cromwell was forced to create a governing class and give it a victory. Wellington's rise to Colonel of the 33rd Regiment of Foot was owing to his connection to his brother, who was, when that brother went to India, to become the Governor-General of that part of India which belonged to the East India Company. So the brothers belonged to an aristocracy which had ruled Britain since the time of Cromwell. Wellington was born in the British territory of Ireland as one of its chief landowning families, and in this way it's possible to see what I mean when I say that Britain was ruled by a cartel. He was a member of a class, a ruling group, who assisted one another to positions of leadership and rule over what they saw as their country. Throughout his life, Wellington never thought twice about maintaining that order of aristocratic rule of the country, that ownership of the land by a few property magnates. The Duke, more than most, saw it as their purpose to manage the country in the service of its corporate personality, namely the King. Reading his biography, which I've read recently by one of his descendants, I've been impressed by the then constitutional arrangements which allowed the interaction of the Prime Minister with the King, and we are able to see what Britain was like when its constitution was working on behalf of the monarch and his supporters. It was the occupation of the Prime Minister to choose from among the MPs in Parliament those most efficient men who could serve as ministers in order to pass legislation which would be pleasing to the King. If any Prime Minister could not find sufficient talent and could not sway the House in this way to pass the legislation which was needed, then it was imperative that that Prime Minister should resign because he could not fulfil his main purpose. During Wellington's period in office as Prime Minister in the early 1830s, there were three major problems which needed resolution. The difficult position he found himself in at that time was that each of these problems had a solution which was not to the benefit of the old cartel or to the aristocratic order of things. You could say that a peaceful resolution to these problems was what the King wanted, and that by resolving them properly, they were serving the King. Wellington had to oversee change, but in such a way that it was not too harmful to his class. The three problems were these. There was social unrest caused by the Corn Laws. There was disruption in Ireland owing to the ban on Catholics serving in government. And finally, the existing demand was for a reform bill which would extend the right to vote to more of the people and to the lower classes, and in addition to prevent MPs from being merely appointed, in many of the Tory constituencies known as rotten boroughs. That problem was resolved satisfactorily by the reform bills, or the first reform bill. Neither of these three problems had a solution favourable to the Tories, such as the Duke himself, or to the King, at that time William IV, who resisted most of the changes. And it seems to have been the job of the Prime Minister to also coax the King or the monarch into accepting the new things that had to happen for the security of the country. After coaxing the monarch into accepting the right of Catholics to have the vote and to have some representation, the Duke failed to support the Reform Bill, and so he was forced to step down before his period in office was formally over, since he could not gather enough support or votes to resist that bill. And his reason was that making changes to the system of nominating MPs, where they could be merely appointed, the system had been that useful, loyal men were appointed as MPs by large landowners with only a nominal vote. And making this impossible would, in Wellington's opinion, destroy the old England. And to allow votes in the cities among the working class would see the end of rule by the landowners. With respect to the Corn Law, which allowed the English landowners a monopoly on the sale of that food, he had no part to play. A speech of his, before his resignation, which he gave in a spirit of defiance against the Whig party, seemed to others of his own party to express an absurd misunderstanding of how Parliament works. He spoke in Parliament as if he were an officer in command of an obedient army, and he in this way made himself seem absurd and fit only for resignation and failure. The changes to the nation were being advocated by the Whig party, who required more power for the industrial business class which they represented, and they needed more seats so as to represent the new cities, such as Manchester. What lies behind the urgency of each of these matters, the Corn Law, the Reform Bill, and the Catholic Bill, was the pressure of the population which threatened a revolution or an uprising. In effect, the Tories were afraid of the people and of the disruption they could cause, and so they tried to conciliate them slowly. In effect, if the changes to the order of things could not happen peacefully and according to process in those years, then there would be violent, disorganized, widespread destruction of the nation. That the cartel whose passing Wellington foresaw had ruled the nation well is to my purpose, because what I'm looking at is how this nation should be ruled properly, in its own interest. That old aristocratic class had ruled the nation in a patriotic way, by and large, because the nation was their own property. They had title to the land, and not to land in any other nation or country. The country was literally their property. That the king's family were not originally British tended toward making it yet more obvious that the Commons and Lords were the true rulers of the nation, and it was a good thing that they were so patriotic for the reason I've just said. It's true that money dominated their interests to an extent and that they suppressed the people in order to retain their control, but they never betrayed the nation. They never allowed foreigners into the country, nor favoured populations and people other than their own. Wellington's chief object of concern was nevertheless not the people. He did not have the interest of the British people as the immediate object of his concern. Rather, it was the king that he considered himself to be in the service of. The king to whom obedience was the first duty of the aristocracy. It would be possible to say that the king was the single place where the land and the people and their rulers were focused into one. In the biography I mentioned before, the writer makes the recurrent observation that the Duke saw himself as a bonded servant of the crown, like somebody who had been hired under duress to be a servant, and that he had no will of his own. He considered himself to be a mere labourer in the service of the nation. Now, what allowed Wellington to become Prime Minister and to be leader of the Lords was not his political skill in itself, which was not his vocation. Rather, as everyone knows, he was the man who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo as the general in command of the Allied troops there in 1815. He was first of all a soldier. He became the commander of the British Army because he had successfully led that army already for around a decade in Spain against Napoleon's marshals, and prior to that he had learned to lead large formations in the methods of contemporary war in India. The character of generalship in that era was a kind of massive game of chess. The weapons at the disposal of the commander of an army could be seen in the interactions of the British and French armies on the peninsula, which were spent advancing not to acquire territory, but so as to destroy the enemy's assets, its army formations, in brief and large-scale battles involving tens of thousands of obedient men. A commander might attack and capture a town and then retreat from it, as happened frequently on the peninsula, since his objective was not to acquire land or towns, but to force the enemy to run out of men and supplies. So organised advance and retreat in formation meant success, while disorganisation meant the loss of equipment and men. A general aimed to choose the correct opportunity and place to engage in battle in such a way that the conditions were favourable to him and not to his enemy. As was pointed out in the constitutional work by the essayist Badgerhout in the 1860s, the British Army's foremost commanders at that time, 50 years later, had the main job of being of administration and logistics, which was made a change from the time when a commander was principally involved in direct fighting. Wellington was roughly 50 years of age at the time of Waterloo, and leaving the service at a time when he was known around the world as the man who defeated Napoleon, he was a natural choice to be the Foreign Secretary on England's behalf in the newly liberated Europe, and that was to be his entry into political service. After his first term in office, he was called back to serve when Peel's government fell, and he served for a while without a cabinet, and, so to speak, he served as a single agent in charge of all aspects of the British government. There was no cabinet, there was just him, which is why he can be referred to correctly, but only for reasons of humour, as a dictator. In his lifetime, and because of the character of the new age which was emerging, he was considered the greatest Englishman alive. It could be said that the ideal of the stoic, quiet, decisive Englishman derived entirely from his example. The self-reliant, honest, scrupulous, individualistic leader who showed no emotion but only an immovable, determined calm was the ideal which developed throughout the 19th century, and it originates to a large extent in him. His principal genius was in the management of an army and engagement of it in battles on his own terms. In those days, political disputes between nations were decided by pitched open battles in which one side attempted to destroy the other and make it retreat in chaos. It could be said that because of the compliant nature of the people in those times, so then once their aristocratic leader had been defeated and their professional army had been made to flee the field, so the people of each nation saw no further reason to rise up and continue the fight afterwards. In contradistinction to the period of total mobilization, which is typical of the 20th century and maybe of our own time, where every man is expected to pick up a rifle and continue the fight until nobody is left alive in the entire country. Formal battles of attrition lasting no more than a couple of days, by and large, could determine the fate of a nation's leadership. Political rivalry had once been between kings and the armies that the king could field, and to an extent it remained so in Wellington's time. The relationship of the majority of the people to their king and their cartel of elite aristocrats was a deferential, subservient one. Wellington was known for his compassion for his officers and private soldiers, and they gave him deference. And while he succeeded so well in war, it was because of his attentive provisioning of them and making sure that they were efficient. He achieved this by what you could call caring about them. Still, the majority of his massive forces were drawn from the class of desperate men who had no other possible occupation, which is why he more than once referred to them notoriously as the scum of the earth. They were not armies of citizens, they were armies of subordinates, and only the senior officers had any right to call themselves free Englishmen. This could strike somebody as strange, that he could be said then to have had compassion and care for them, for these armies made up of the scum of the earth. But we'll get on to that. It's worthwhile for me to outline a few distinguishing characteristics of the Duke. He was the kind of man who did everything for himself, which seems to contradict the idea that he was some kind of elite aristocrat. We might immediately think that everyone was serving him. This is the reverse of the truth. He shaved himself. He designed his own boots. He cleaned his own boots. Apparently somebody walked in on him in his tent, because he used tents along with the men rather than palatial buildings which he might have occupied. One of his officers found him cleaning his boots and asked him why he was cleaning his own boots. And he replied, "Well, whose boots do you clean?" As if to say, everybody should clean their boots. And if you don't do your own, you must be doing somebody else's. He did his own reconnaissances, his own recce's, prior to any battle. He didn't subcontract the small or the large details of his activity as a commander. He spent his life in the field on horseback, rather than in a carriage, or rather than staying back behind the lines in a grand mansion looking at maps. He tended to do his own reconnaissance and planning, and to ensure the provision for his soldiers for every eventuality. And he had that kind of character which was prepared to get its hands dirty in order to ensure success. He is known to have taken short naps before a battle, being sure before he went to sleep that everything was in order, and yet having very small amounts of sleep because he'd spent most of the night planning. He could sleep soundly because, as I've said, he was quite confident everything would go to plan. And he wrote his own dispatches back to London late into the night on his own, like a junior officer. He was one of the first of what came to be known around the world as the English gentleman. He was short in his speech and courteous at all times, and he expected absolute obedience to his commands, so he could grow very angry if one of his officers had not followed his commands to the letter. Because he had already tended towards working out exactly how he should direct the battle, and so his politeness and calmness were due to his implicitly expecting every subordinate to follow that plan. Now, to return to that part about his being compassionate and how he provided for his men, this was a double-edged thing and did not spring from compassion for its own sake. He cared for the men because they were an instrument which should be kept in good order and not be wasted. His principle of efficiency and making no bones about empty ceremony, but rather pursuing what was pragmatically possible and what would work, can be seen in the fine details, such that it characterized his personality entirely. For instance, he wore a plain grey frock coat unadorned with medals or other regalia on the battlefield. And one detail which I almost forgot is that his men loved him. The men loved him for the same reason that his country loved him. It was for the pragmatic, simple reason that he was able to win battles. It was not because of the compassion that he showed them. It was because when he was in charge, the British soldier knew that he was in safe hands and would be used only in order to defeat the enemy, and not for some other purpose, such as the distracting pride of his commander. Stupid, incompetent generals are, perhaps, the worst thing a soldier can contemplate. He'd been in charge of the army for so many years and seen them so competently through so many battles that his own men tended to cheer his arrival on the battlefield, and the morale of the British units rose and fell as they knew whether or not they were being led by Wellington or not. At the time of the Peninsular War, which he had decided on his own initiative to initiate against the occupying French, there were at least 95 regiments of foot at his disposal. It's noteworthy that it was Wellington's own plan, delivered to the House of Commons, that he would lead a small army into Spain against Napoleon's forces there. The lack of welfare, which was characteristic of England at that time, the lack of, I mean state-provided welfare and payments for the unemployed, coupled with the population growth in England and Ireland, was such that each battalion could sometimes number 1,000 men and was vastly oversubscribed. People were almost desperate to join the army. And although they were out of work and from the scum of the earth class, the soldiers were expected to behave according to Wellington's high principles. Above all, he would not allow any looting or any mistreatment of the native populations of Spain or France. So while the French army lived off the land and took what they needed where they could find it, Wellington, whose soldiers had to live off the provisions supplied by him, had to very carefully request money and those provisions from the British government back in Westminster. When his soldiers were found to be behaving in a way which would alienate the Spanish, French or Portuguese natives by looting and the like, he had those men flogged and in some cases executed as an example. Again, his idea was that the war could only be won with the support of the native populations, and it was not out of any consideration for them in themselves that they were spared from being looted and their cities pillaged. It was because this was a means by which to win the war. And perhaps it's possible to say that he had no inherent compassion for them, but only required their support. It's noteworthy that the Whigs were continually in danger of shutting off his supplies, as I've mentioned, that he had to fund his own army, either by his own means or with the help of the taxation that was raised at the time. And both the Peninsular and Waterloo campaigns were paid for with loans that he arranged from the Rothschild Bank. And Wellington had to arrange his own provisions and money for the army in some cases. At that time, there was no income tax, and the government expenditure did not go much further than providing for the army. The government was not interested in raising taxes for any other reason than for military purposes, and so they had a keen interest in what Wellington was doing with their money. And the Whigs were continuously threatening to withdraw funding. The first income tax, which today makes up 50%, along with national insurance, 50% of government revenue, was only tried out in the 1840s. And it was for this reason that when he had successfully defeated the French in Spain and Portugal, and when he had marched on towards Paris through France, leading to the abdication of Napoleon, his army was almost immediately disbanded by Parliament, which was not prepared to any longer pay for it. So that when less than a year later the French once again threatened Europe, only around half of his peninsular army was available to serve, the others having been disbanded. In this way, we see how England or Britain retained its independence from France by means of warfare, initiated by a military commander of genius from among the ranks of its aristocracy, who I have called flippantly a cartel. And it successfully avoided revolutionary socialism in England by means of careful gradual change to its constitutional arrangements, by, for instance, striking bargains with the king and between the Lords and the MPs and the people, which they called legislation. These things were possible because the rulers of the land were also its owners and were interested in its survival in a recognisable form, and they did not want to share the country or give it up to foreigners. Here we see the successful survival of Britain in this ownership of the land by a cartel, which was successful and tolerated, and we also see how it slowly passed away. Moving on to the second part of this essay, it's my contention that there is already a war going on in Britain of the kind which is different from the kind of troubles which affected England in the early 19th century. I would say that there is a hybrid form of warfare going on against the British people by a certain type of person who is also apparently British, but not so. And so the country is in a hybrid civil war. And I would also like to advocate for a conclusion to this war by doing something radical. It would be right to ask whether a cartel or a certain class of people today rule England in the same way as they did then. And my answer would be that no, there is no such cartel. I will come on to suggest that what we now face today is more like the Civil War situation, where two groups of people hold diametrically opposed beliefs, and that this is not a class situation, more of a religious belief situation. So we do not face revolution of one class trying to take from another class what they believe is theirs, rather two opposed types of belief fighting via large sections of our population. And reconciliation is not really possible through politics because beliefs very rarely compromise with one another. It would be possible to show that the threats of violence against the people, which I am convinced are happening all of the time against the British people, are now directed downwards, and that the people are not asking for revolution. In fact, I changed my mind about this. I do not think it's a question of higher and lower. There's no violence downwards. We see this in the case of Nigel Farage, who cannot be claimed by anybody to be working class. And my experience of the Reform Party is that the people who are members of that party are not working class. They are just as middle or upper or lower class as the people who are part of the what they refer to in a simplistic way as the lanyard class. The lanyard class being the ruling Tory, Labour, just the people who are in government permanently. They're the lanyard class. And Reform represents a class of people who don't seem to have a political power, who do feel that they don't have political power. It's not a class opposition. The British people are being destroyed for no sensible reason. It would be possible to say that the ruling cartel do not seem to be particularly British, and to doubt that they have any British sympathies or ownership at all. And I would say that they are what you could call internationalists. Their beliefs are international. And they are carrying out a hybrid war on the British people, who by definition are not international. They're British. And on the British country. It should be easy to demonstrate this by contrasting the situation today, in 2026, with what it was 200 years ago, in, let's say, 1826. My thesis shall be that Britain is under attack, and that it is a war already. We just do not know this because it's what you could call a hybrid war. The differences between the Britain of that era and this are stark, but not inexhaustibly so. Not inexhaustible, and we can locate the differences. First of all, in the 1800s, parish funds were the only remedy for those who had no employment or family, or joining the military and the navy, finding occupation in the new cities, which is why the armies which Wellington could call on were so large. Soldiers joined in order to be kept fed and clothed, and parishes were dominated by the local church, which organised funds for the destitute from local taxes. The difference between that system and the one that we've got today is that the government has vastly increased its power and stepped into the territory of the local parishes and into the territory of the armies and other occupations. The British state currently has above 45% of all the productive activity in this country, whereas at the time of the Napoleonic Wars it was more like 5%. So there's a tenfold increase in the size and power of the state. And I'll go back to this later, but the people who work for the state, which is 25% of our population, are all of one party. And I think that in order to belong to that party and have that employment, they are committed to internationalism, which is how we can say that the British state is at war with Britain. Because an international class of people, 25% of the working population of Britain, is committed to an internationalist belief system. And, as we've said, they have 50% of the productive output of our nation, so they're a very formidable enemy of the British. When the government stepped into this territory, it did so gradually, and this involved Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, and it did so over the century as it noticed the activities of Prussia. So it did so under pressure. The poor and the unemployed are not, in our time, used as sailors and soldiers or put to work in industry. Rather, they are given from the general national tax collection. And the results of elections and the activity of politicians is largely concerned with how much of this money is given to those people and where the money will come from. This is perhaps the most important distinction between Wellington's time and ours, namely the efficient tax collection of the state, which is a tenfold increase, and its distribution to the lower half of the population in economic terms. But not only to the lower half of the population, you could say that it's a sort of form of national socialism where the tax is collected from the people at large and then distributed to favoured businesses in the same way as corporate fascism used to do in the 20th century. This is the system under which Britain currently operates. So there's a welfareism to look after the people, and then corporate preferences paid for by a socialist state in the same way as the Italians and the Germans used to in their periods of fascism. In a word, socialism or communism is what currently rules Great Britain. And the cartel which runs Britain is generally what you could call, across all social classes, a communistic one, with elements of nationalist socialism. Because what tax is collected and owned and possessed by the state is given to preferred private businesses, which is a distinctive characteristic of National Socialism, or the unnameable. It would be possible to say that in our day politicians are somehow powerless before the universal vote. I've heard it said recently that this country is ungovernable because the people have too much information and too many voices. And this is why it is said the political class are not in command of the nation. And it would be my point that the political class are not in command of the nation in the same way as Wellington was. But it's not because the people are ungovernable. I would say that the country is ungovernable because the people who are in charge ought not to be there, and they're incompetent. And due to historical intentional actions and accidents, the people in Parliament both are incompetent, and even if they were competent, they would still find activity severely constrained by previous legislation. There's no one class which commands the nation, but rather an impersonal socialistic total mobilization of the population is at work, which has recently been called the social contract. I disagree with the definition of the social contract, which I'm now going to outline, but most people seem to think the social contract is a means by which the nation's hive-like compact between all people is carried out. The social contract means, in our modern day world, a communism to which everybody submits. So the contract is you take part in the communism, you obey the government, and the government gives you welfare. It's not a contract because there's no choice about entering into it. I would say that there is nobody in real command of our country today because this social contract, so-called, means that there are no classes and no one's in charge, but that everyone together works as a single entity in reciprocal giving of taxes and receiving of benefits. Meanwhile, the country has no voice. The nation is unable and sees it as unnecessary to have an armed expeditionary forces, which is one of the indications that the nation has been neglected. It's true that the people who submit to the state in the social contract may have a nice job and payment and welfare, but the country, as a distinct entity amongst other nations, has no armed expeditionary forces. Lacking an armed forces and a Prime Minister whose only job it is to find an income to pay for the sick and the unemployed and the elderly, we can see that Parliament is not in control of the nation. Without an armed forces of any use, there cannot properly be said to be a nation. Nevertheless, Britain still has a history of being an independent nation. And the relatives and descendants of the British of Wellington's time are still inhabiting this island. It's my contention that they're being subjected to a war and to destruction by the state, which I've described. They either join in this communistic internationalist enterprise of a nation without an armed forces or any borders, or they're destroyed. And they are being destroyed through hybrid warfare. You could say it's a hybrid civil war at the moment. If we were to consider that the individual ought to be free to choose his own destiny and, for instance, look after his own property and his nation in the way he sees fit, and that this is no longer possible for an individual properly, then we can already say that the British nation, composed of individuals, is already almost impossible and in danger. That war is going on against the British people is clear from the invasion of foreigners from outside Europe, which has not only happened but continues to do so every day. And in addition, you see the downgrading or replacement of the people, something which is beyond question, because the more foreigners that are brought in, the smaller percentage of ownership of this country the native British people have. But the effects of replacement are more complex than this and involve a lower birth rate, so that for every unborn child in Britain, a foreigner is brought in, and more, which constitutes replacement. See also the harassment, the constant harassment of the native British people with an ideology which most people find absurd. This is what they refer to as woke. And this is not usually spoken of as a war, and that's why it's remarkable that the idea of hybrid war is so frequently spoken of today in other contexts. Hybrid war is something which most people now understand to be a reality, because it's said, for instance, that Russia is carrying out a hybrid war against the British through means of deception, misinformation, cyber warfare, or the interference of civilians wearing non-combat uniforms, nevertheless acting in a hostile way inside our country. This is known as hybrid war. Now, I would say that this is clearly happening inside Britain, and the aggressor is the British state. I don't want to go into the details of the prime ministers who made this happen slowly, because they were all equally to blame. They all belong to the same kind of caste. It's not class, it's a caste. You join this caste by having the right characteristics, namely that you believe in an international ideology and you're willing to serve, and that you give up any loyalty to Britain. I could mention the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as minor features of the pathway toward this, because the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were not done on behalf of Britain, they were done on behalf of the United States and globalization. There was a global project underway there to destroy, as they are now trying to destroy Russia, any countries which are not part of the international system. Now, I could also talk about the rise to prominence of the City of London, which could be said to have replaced the physical empire of Britain with a financial one. And the City of London does not really need Britain and Britain's people, so it's not in the interests of the city to look after the British people either. Now, this, alongside the Afghan wars and so on, and the rise of Tony Blair and the disestablishment of the House of Lords and everything else which has gone on, these are just features along the pathway towards where we are. Membership of NATO has been another reason why Britain has been the attempt is being made to destroy Britain, because NATO is an armed forces which requires British weaponry and money, but does not require the existence of Britain as an individual nation. In fact, the existence of individual nations is a bit of a hindrance to NATO. We know about the membership of the EU as well. another reason why Britain has been consciously destroyed or unconsciously destroyed in some cases. It's unhelpful to frame this war of destruction against the British, which is a hybrid civil war, as anything to do with class. Sometimes it's common to say that the British people are kind of like a class, lower class mostly, they're characterised as, being attacked by an upper middle class faction of lanyard-wearing international globalists. This is not accurate. This would frame it in terms of a revolutionary situation such as we found in Wellington's time, where the poor and the disenfranchised were rising up against their betters. This is not the situation today. To me, it seems more likely to be a confrontation such as it was when the Anglo-Catholic establishment, which had intensified its hold on England in the 1630s, was resisted violently by the Calvinists and other individualistic oddballs of the Protestant England, who were variously and religiously motivated. If this were the sort of ruling class conflict of the ruling class versus the people type, then a feeling of fear would persuade the ruling class to compromise with the people, as they did in the 1830s. Fear of class revolution usually forces an establishment to concede some territory and to see reason. But in our time of war and civil war, there is no compromise, because the ruling establishment, who I've referred to as the internationalists, are not a class, they're a caste, and they voluntarily come and go from it. And they do so on the basis of their belief system. So anyone can join or leave their caste, regardless of their amount of money or property they own. Dominic Cummings has said recently that the ruling caste will go to any lengths to destroy Nigel Farage. They will attack his family, they will attack him legally, they will attack his private property, they will attack where his money is coming from, and so on. And they will do this by whatever means are at their disposal, fair or foul, going so far as to even carry out an orange revolution or a colour revolution inside Britain, should reform ever be elected legitimately to office. But you can see that this is not a traditional class struggle by the fact that Farage and Richard Tice and many others of their type are wealthy, productive, independent people, and so are a vast majority of their supporters. My experience tells me that most reform supporters and candidates are successful business owner types. They're not lower class people. This is not a class war. And on the other side, their opponents, men such as Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, are also wealthy men who believe in money and free enterprise like they do. This is not a class struggle. What this is a difference of belief. On the one side, those who hold power, by the way, are those who believe in the EU and in global citizenship along Kantian lines. They believe that human being is a citizen of the world. And on the other side are those people who believe broadly in the story of mankind as it's laid down in Genesis, such that they understand life to be that a man must work, have his own plot of land, have his own children, and then die in a particular nation, and that there is no such thing as a global humanity. And this is where the sticking point of our national borders can be highlighted. The globalist international person who generally governs Great Britain at this time has no trouble with open borders, whereas the border must be protected at all costs to the other side, to the British person. You could say that Reform believes in sin and work, while the globalists believe that mankind has taken God's place and that mankind is limitless and aspires with a kind of faith to assume divine attributes. Mankind, for them, has a certain set of rights, which are they would never say that they're divinely given, but from what you can understand with the ferocity with which they're defended, they are divine gifts, eternally written for mankind in general, and not for any individual of any nation. The opponents of Farage, the internationalists, are the kinds of people who consider war to be a thing of the past, and who already discuss, and who are ready to discuss, how the sexual difference between men and women, for example, is also a thing of the past. They're ready to discuss this, if not to consent to it straight away. They're global internationalist humanitarians with a firm ethical commitment, and their ethos, where the ethos is derived from global citizenship. So their ethics tend to be globalized. And as I've mentioned, I think this was one of the inspirational ideas for the Afghan and Iraq wars, or one of the justifications that the Iraqi government and the Afghan government don't behave in the ethical way in which global citizens ought to behave. And they say the same about the British. Any purely British-based ethics is not appropriate for global citizens. So when British people say we want our borders shut, this is claimed to be unethical because international global citizens of the world don't believe in borders. And they claim that it's wrong to want to keep people out of your country. Ethically wrong. This difference of opinion is a practically religious difference of opinion. And it will not find compromise by means of Parliament. One side is not ready to give way to the other. The good people of the ethical global citizen are not going to give way in some kind of compromise to the British, who have their own set of ethics. But I do think that the reform kind of man has been giving way absent-mindedly because he did not know that there was a hybrid war taking place against him. The war's been going on without his noticing it, and he hasn't been able to understand what's going on. Which is why I think that the recent angry formal resignation of Nigel Farage is more like an act of guerrilla war and a drastic sudden awakening to consciousness of his situation, more than it is a piece of conventional political manoeuvring. I would also point out that it appears to be a contradiction and a paradox if I tell the listener that British MPs are all internationalists. How could you claim that internationalists are running a national parliament? It makes no sense, and it ought not to be happening, or it ought not to be possible. But it is very easily possible that internationalists are running the national parliament and destroying the nation. You could hardly believe such a thing could take place. Nevertheless, let's say that MP X is elected by Town X, and he goes to the British Parliament in order to represent the international order. You would scratch your head about this, since wasn't MP X elected to represent his town and his country? How could he be representing global humanity instead? I can't claim to explain how this is possible, but I do know that it is very possible, since such things obviously have happened in the case of Nigel Farage himself, who proved that it's possible because he was elected to be the European Parliament representative, one of the European Parliament representatives representing Great Britain. And while he was in the European Parliament, it was his specific stated intention to destroy that Parliament and to disband the European Union. And I think that this is what's going on with the MPs of Great Britain today, that they are elected to the British Parliament and their specific intention is to destroy that Parliament and destroy the nation. They do so in the name of international citizenship and that type of ethics which I've described. I suppose that there is only one way that the word war could be given to this situation, and it's as follows. If any man believes that Britain has an independent future belonging to the British people, then it would be necessary to fight for it, by making changes which only violent force can bring about, and vice versa. The only way that an internationalist can force a British person to give up their natural right to their country and their culture is by forcing them to do so, whether by direct means of force or by hybrid warfare of propaganda, misinformation and silent theft and so on, or people wearing uniforms or avoiding wearing uniforms when they are actually involved in a war. This is what we call hybrid warfare. There is a hybrid civil war taking place against Britain. Now, it's possible to see how dangerous the situation is if the British ever intended to flush out the enemy by taking the only means at their disposal, which would be, for example, to leave the EU, to leave NATO, and to properly police their own financial system in a national way, and buy back the overseas currency. Britain, to my mind, would almost immediately become on the same list as on which the names Russia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and so on are found. Britain would be added to that list, as far as most internationalists are concerned. And eventually, if Britain were to leave NATO, the EU, the financial system, and to take its own interests as the only ones that it's going to pursue, if it was to take those interests alone in hand, it would become an international enemy of most of the other global countries. And I have said elsewhere that I think that's what's happened to Russia. Russia is simply following its own interest rather than taking part in the global community. And so it's been blacklisted. And the hybrid war was practiced against it, financial war and so on. And it eventually was provoked into fighting back as disastrously as we now know. I refuse to believe that bankers and banking form our ruling class. Money is not a person or a people. We typically say that we should follow the money if we want to find out who had carried out some kind of evil or some sort of crime. We say follow the money and we'll find out who it was. But money also follows every success. So anything which is successful, the money tends to follow behind it. So money is not really an agent in itself. And bankers are simply the people who deal with money. And in the quality of money by itself, they have no real agency of their own. They, like the Rothschilds following Wellington, they simply follow where they see success. So I don't blame the banks or the bankers, nor do I blame the city. And I would expect the City of London to assist either side of this war, depending on who was going to be most successful, whether it was the British or the internationalists. I'm now going to talk about the attack that we must make, or that we could propose to make, against the nation of France. Before I do so, I want to point out that there is no sense either in blaming the Muslims. Somebody would say we're in a war, hybrid war, civil war with the government, and also we're at war with Muslims. Well, Muslims are inimical to Britain, as I've said elsewhere. Their ideology is inimical. It has an animus against Great Britain by its nature, because it is a constitution for a nation. It is also inimical to the globalist interests. And I think it's a third party in this game, this war, which we can disregard for the time being, because Islam is not in command of Great Britain, whereas communism is, internationalism is. To return to France, we now ask, if military commanders believe, rightly, that the best form of defence is attack, so wouldn't it be right to say that the best way of protecting Britain would be to make an attack on the enemy? We've already said the enemy is a belief, it's not a class of people. So making an attack on that enemy is not really possible. You can't make an attack on a belief. It's almost as if we need to flush out a specific part of the enemy's existence which will allow us to destroy it. And we do not know what that place is. It's almost as if we want to give a face to the enemy and be able to resolve all the problems by locating a specific place and time and person. And I think that one would have to start the war in order to find out who the enemy is. You should not start a war inside Britain in order to find out who your enemy in Britain is, because all kinds of other people, including people of our own side, would come out to complain and say that we've done wrong. But it remains, just as a surgeon might have to do investigative work on a body, by cutting into it, knowing that there is a cancer somewhere, and might make mistakes in cutting away at different areas, doing moderate amounts of harm, before finding the root of the illness in the body. And so in order to fix Britain as a nation, some organised intervention of a violent kind like this would be necessary. It's just where to start. And once the opening has been made, it's easier to find out where the enemy's headquarters and sources of power lie. We've already said that the NATO headquarters, the EU and so on are the enemy, but this is a very diffuse. That we've also pointed out that the enemy is a belief system, and so that even if NATO was shut down, the belief system would remain. Thinking about this intractable difficulty and the nature of the enemy being a kind of spirit rather than a physical opponent, my suggestion would be to make the initial surgical intervention into the body politic by an invasion of the nation of France. This would revive England's historical destiny and destroy all of those historical illnesses which we've already discussed, such as the EU, the NATO, the new constitution brought in by Tony Blair, and the indifference of the City of London. An invasion of France by the United Kingdom would fatally injure the whole idea of NATO, and it would also show the European Union as an unreal country and would cause chaos in those people who believe in it. It would also have other side effects, such as drawing into employment all those people who are currently unemployed and receiving massive amounts of state assistance. It would also highlight immediately those people in Britain who are disloyal to the nation because the complaints and taking side of France would become so obvious. And in one single act, all of these illnesses would be highlighted. For whatever elements reside in Britain which are not loyal to it would become apparent immediately. As a means of reviving the nation's character, it would work. And perhaps this is the solution that I personally have in mind, somewhere in the back of my mind, when I ask, would it be reviving? How can we revive England? And we should also ask, would this be a cost worth paying? To return England to its ancestral independence and character, you have to do the same things as have ancestrally occurred. And coincidental to my composing of this article, an article has appeared today in the Spectator magazine, which says precisely the same thing as I am suggesting here. Or rather, it predicts that as the United States withdraws its protective umbrella away from Europe, then the most immediate and eternal danger to all of the nations of Europe shows itself, namely that they will all begin almost immediately to distrust one another and prepare to fight one another. This is what the United States has provided for the last 80 years, namely peace in Europe, by making sure that none of the nations inside Europe attack one another. But it's as Machiavelli said of Italy in the early 1500s. This group of separate nations and towns must be united into a single country. And it can only be united successfully with a legitimate authority. And the legitimate authority which combined England to France or Europe into one whole nation, that authority will only rise through a war. When the superiority of one particular nation is proven. And so, as well as saying that war is inevitable in Europe, we can also say that it would be beneficial in the long run by being able to unify the continent. Do I therefore say that France is the enemy with whom we are already at war? I've said that we're in hybrid war and the enemy is destroying Britain. Is France that enemy? And the answer is no. It is true. The French do send around 1,000 young, aggressive, uncontainable men and undesirable men to our country every week. They spend about 200, 300 men every single day, all year round. France does this. And to that extent, France is the enemy. But France is not intrinsically or alone the cause of Britain's loss of identity and ownership of itself. France, after all, suffers the same problems as Britain does. Nevertheless, what if the salvation of both nations and the joining of one to the other can be achieved after a fight in which one of them submits to rule by the other? I would say that after such an event, the immigration problem would also be solved for both nations. And in the meantime, we must admit that the internationalists, which you could call a cartel which rules Britain, they're destroying it because it has obligations to the rest of the world in various ways. They destroy Britain because Britain is part of the world in various ways, and they facilitate the payment of those obligations. They have no real choice. They are the internationalist class. I believe this class of people, or this caste of people, they would fervently oppose any war with France. And they would justify their position by revealing to us that they are not British, and they're not French either, but they're a species of disloyal internationalists who prefer to war on Britain and to destroy it, as they have been doing for a few decades. A war with France and an invasion of France, which we should aim to make successful, would also make it necessary to put aside our current style or class of political leaders. Our political leaders, the 650 MPs, the ministers, potentially we could put in the civil service along there, they're not marked out as belonging to a class or an interest. They can only in some cases to be said to be British at all. Some of them are actually foreigners. They're just people. They're not a class. They're distinguished from British people by having different beliefs. But nevertheless, as individuals, the only particular skill that they have is they have the knack of being politicians, and so they could easily be disposed of. They give no value to the nation. They don't represent the rich, or they don't represent the poor, the aristocratic class of merchants. They are bureaucrats in a communistic type system. They've been offered jobs because they have a desire for those jobs, and they got to the front of the queue before anyone else. Running our country is to them an occupation, with its wages, its perks, and a certain celebrity. It's similar to the way in which Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, because she became Prime Minister simply because she'd done 20 years in Parliament and had risen through the ranks through hard work and became Education Secretary, so that when the vacancy of Prime Minister was offered to 4 or 5 candidates, she happened to be one of them. All of the MPs are the same. There's no particular skill. They happen to be at the right place at the right time. And as people, they're characterised by nothing special, and as the ruling class, they're characterised definitely by having a belief in internationalism. One could say with absolute right that the current political class have this universal aim for Britain, to maintain its benefits for the people who live there, and very little else. And this is why I'm saying this, I suppose, in order to point out that they could be removed from office without any particular result happening, and that instead of having a state geared around welfare, for a short period of time at least, there would be a state geared around warfare. It could be said that British politicians, as we now have them, cannot be trying to destroy Britain and its parliament. But I've already said, in the case of Nigel Farage, that elected politicians do have the possibility to destroy their own country and their own parliament. And it's my conviction that the international style of politics which now takes place means that all MPs and politicians of Britain are trying to destroy Britain. I'm going to now conclude with some final remarks about the specific dangers faced by the generation of the Duke of Wellington. Only some short remarks. And finally, a brief conclusion. I wanted to just clear up how I think that the war in Europe, in order to establish dominance over the continent, is inevitable, as was said in the Spectator article this week, and as Machiavelli would have pointed out. Europe, in this world where there are 4 or 5 major superpowers, Europe needs to unify itself, and the European Union is not the means to do that. And as the United States withdraws, a fight will take place between the countries of Europe until one of them establishes dominance and establishes a legitimate form of government for the whole continent. That was what the First and the Second World Wars were about. And the third, we hope it's not going to be a third World War, because we would like this to happen in an orderly and very quick way. And the sooner it happens, the better, because as time passes, each of the European nations will start to rediscover its individual identity, and it will start to rearm. And the more armaments there are in Europe, the longer the war will last. If a war against France and then against the rest of Europe is fought on its own terms and fought in the right way, it's highly desirable. Such a war would bring about a return of our national history and character, and it will also bring about a revival of the character of the rest of the continent in this new age. They will throw aside the silly idea of international human being, of the citizen of the world, and the associated ethics which allow people to wander about the world, taking welfare and the benefits where they find them, as if there were no private property anymore. Whether Britain first needs a patriotic government, or whether it will discover a patriotic government when the war begins after the attack on France, it doesn't matter. The question is, not which shall we do first, get ourselves a patriotic government or invade France first. One will bring about the other. And it will root out the enemy and make them flee our country. So the hybrid war, or the civil war which is taking place against Britain, will end at that point. Almost by finding an enemy outside of ourselves, we stop the fighting within. It will invent a patriotic government and a patriotic constitution, and it will give purpose to our people as of old. And finally, Europe needs to be united in this way. To return to Pitt, the Prime Minister at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Why did Pitt attempt to fight? I don't think that he especially attempted to invade France, but he did declare war against all the French assets overseas and where possible, try to destroy their military and their navy. He did so for 2 reasons. The first reason was in order to defeat and to make it impossible for communism or socialism and revolution to take place in Britain. So Pitt declared war on France in order to stop communism from taking root in Britain. He thought that the revolutionary spirit would come to Britain, and there would be revolution here, and the toppling of the monarchy, the end of the aristocracy, and so on. The second reason why Pitt declared war on France was more practical, namely, France had attacked Belgium or the lowlands, the Low Countries, which affected British trade. Here is an example of, and there have been dozens throughout our history, of the time when a British politician decides to attack France. And there were sensible reasons which, to some extent, I comically point out, apply today. We would invade France in order to deter communism. And to return to Wellington, we could ask, does France or Europe in general threaten the livelihood of a particular class of our nation? Does France constitute an enemy of any kind? Does it affect our trade? Or is France forever a non-hostile state as far as we're concerned? In fact, in this day and age, is there any real difference between France and England anymore? And has the EU done its principal task of joining them together, the nations of Europe? And as I've already pointed out, there is one very drastic bad thing which the French do to Britain, which is to send roughly 60,000 hostile men to us every single year, and continue to do so, and will do so for the foreseeable future, unless they're stopped. So, in order to stop this invasion, Sooner or later, and I think sooner is better, Britain should prepare for war with France. Here's my conclusion. Please bear with me. I don't see any way of restraining the ambitions of the British internationalists. And I mean the British government, the British civil service, the 25% of people who were employed by the state, including the police and so on. I don't see any way of restraining their ambitions against Britain and preventing the overturning and the mass destruction and replacement of our people other than by resort to war. Better than war against the government itself, as in a civil war, would be war with France. And the aim of war against France would be to bring about in both of our countries a rule by a cartel of people, as the cartel of aristocrats did in Wellington's time, who have an interest in those nations and have the nation's best interests at heart and are not interested, and people who are not interested in humanity in general, who are not interested in open borders and limitless free trade. A war with France would likely bring about those elements in France which support the nation, and they may even encourage that invasion, and they may take the side of the British army as it went into France. And after France had been successfully subdued, the first thing to do would be to repatriate the hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants in Britain back to France, and then by use of the French army to repatriate them still further back to where they came from in Spain or Germany. And the French authorities would be obliged to repatriate them in this way. Who knows whether or not, having reached Spain and Germany, the illegal immigrants would not be repatriated back exactly to where they came from in a peaceful exchange. In order for the armed forces of Great Britain to win that war with France, then a class of efficient patriotic men would be needed. And that class of men and women who prefer international global humanity, in the Kantian sense, in the ethical way which betrays Britain, and the people who do not recognise our country as sovereign anymore, they would declare themselves for the enemy, and we would remove them from any position when they can further harm our country. But the details of how the war would unfold, and who would be employed in it, and even how we would get the momentum and the control of the army in order to carry out the invasion of France, are for another time. Thanks for listening.